Well, thank you all for going into overtime for us today to fill in the rest of our day with the workshop. We'd just like to continue as we left off last time. Everything was going well. We'll just be using the same format as before. So we'll just go straight to
Thank you.
I think it's allocation taking of water at high flows. I think it's the next one.
That one?
Correct.
Yep.
Yes.
Wait.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'll be introducing the main messages, but also be assisted by Jackie, who's online. Taking water at high flows is something that we previously referred to as supplementary allocation. Basically, it's something that has garnered a lot of interest. And it's also quite critical, I think, under the new plan for a number of reasons. It kind of gives us a little bit more resilience when dealing with climate change, but it also gives us more resilience, or water users more resilience, when it comes to dealing with new minimum flows and new take limits for primary allocation. Those water taking at higher flows means you can store water, which means you can bridge the periods that there will be minimum flow restrictions. They're actually also really important for river systems themselves, because those high flows, they provide for sediment transport, but also provide for increased mobility of species. But the one thing is that really, like, measuring the impacts of high flow water taking is not a straightforward thing to do. We got some feedback from the community on what we proposed, and the main thing was that there needs to be more clarity. We provided some policy direction, but they actually want more clarity as to how it's going to work. Also, we got feedback that there is a need for strong policy that on one hand is enabling, but at the same time also make sure that when you harvest, particularly from tributaries, which are smaller in size but often have higher values, that high flow water taking doesn't impact on those high values, and also that it doesn't impede our ability to provide for flow variability and natural flow patterns. So basically, what we're proposing is to refine the framework. When we previously talked about primary allocation, we made a distinction between catchments with low hydrological modification, where we apply a default based on haze, and then the ones with high hydrological modification, where we need bespoke limits. And so we propose to actually adopt a similar approach for the catchments in the first category, so low hydrological modification. We're proposing a default method based on a 3-to-1 flow sharing regime. And basically what that means is that for every quantity that you take out of the river, you have to make sure that 3 times the size of that stays in the river. Also, we want that to apply across the entire catchment, so main stems as well as tribs. For catchments with high hydrological modification, again, like with primary, we really need bespoke limits there and bespoke minimum flows for higher flow taking that take into account catchment characteristics and existing takes. For some of those catchments, those bespoke catchments, we can come up with those limits now, but for others, the Manaharakia and the Tari, it's kind of reliant on knowledge about what the final allocation limit is going to be. So it's something that we will have to backfill later on. However, we need something in the plan now as an interim to deal with consent applications if they would come up. So for those, we propose an interim regime based on a 4-to-1 flow sharing ratio, commencing taking at medium flow. That is quite conservative, and there's 2 reasons for that. One, ecology, like we want to be precautionary if we allocate water without those bespoke limits in place, but also precautionary from a water user or consent holder point of view. Like once we want to avoid a situation that once we do have those bespoke limits for high flow water harvesting, that we don't have to claw back afterwards again. Now, we put up this proposal. We're happy to take any feedback on the ratios themselves. At the moment, the current ratio in the plan is 1:1. And there's some agreement there that is actually not enough. That's not conservative enough. On the other hand, a 3:1 or a 4:1 as a flow sharing regime is a big step up, but it's kind of like a curve of diminishing returns, basically. We put forward for the default a 3:1 flow sharing regime, but we could consider something between a 2 and a 3. Like that's kind of like the range that we think is kind of good. Does that make sense?
That's for the, is that for the top of the non-modified,
For the default.
the default non-modified ones?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also with the interim regime, like I said, we're proposing a quite precautionary approach for 2 reasons, but happy to have a discussion around the table around, you know, do we bring it down to a 3:1 kind of flow sharing?
Okay, that's awesome. So we'll go into questions. We got Kevin was first, and then Kate, and then Brian.
So the ones where you're going to put the default on, have you met that against what's currently happening in the river as the flows that are already being taken out of the high flow?
As supplementary,
Yeah,
like
yes.
high flow taking.
Yeah, the high flow.
Yeah. So basically, what we've done is we started actually looking at the impacts of doing this, and that picture is not complete. But what we've done is we looked at where do we have supplementary takes at the moment, and there's actually not that many. If you look at the number of primary allocation consents, we've got, I believe, close to 1,500 consents. If we look at the number of supplementary takes, it's a lot less. I believe I've got a list here. It's about 80. The vast majority of them are in catchments with bespoke limits. Like about half of them are probably in the Tari and the Manaharakia. And then there's a few others in the Shag, Kakanui catchment as well. So there will be a small number of creeks where we apply a default that already have a supplementary minimum flow. It wouldn't be too many that are affected, but we still have to kind of find out what, you know, by how much we would restrict them.
Yeah. So subsequent to that, if how do I put this? If we are looking to store water, if we're looking to store water at high flows to ensure that we're not putting pressure on the river at in dry times, is there enough freeboard in those high flows to allow additional storage to be created in areas?
It will probably be dependent on the size of the creek. I think it's maybe Jackie or Tom can kind of jump in, but I think it's something that you need to look at on a case-by-case basis. It will be different for every single catchment, I believe. You know, if you've got
I could probably add to that, Tom. I think the short answer is yes in most cases, Kevin. But Tom's right. You'd need to assess it creek by creek.
Yeah. I see where you're trying to go.
Yeah,
That's
like,
right. Yeah, I'm not disagreeing. Yeah.
For large rivers, if you apply a 3:1 or a 4:1 flow sharing, it will still be a lot of water that is available. But for small ones, you're actually playing with liters per second often.
Yeah.
So we'll go to Okay, yep.
Yeah.
Make sure you're next.
Yeah, no,
So,
fine.
yeah.
Look, I'm going to ask a question, but can I just give some background? I'd like the idea of a ratchet, but I think you can be, again, looking at your toolbox, be using your ratchets in different ways. And for me, if you're looking at people working better collaboratively together in the future, which I think we're given direction to do, if we want that water to be stored, not just to be a private benefit, but to have the benefit of helping the river later, and we want to consider some climate change resilience, I would be saying, I'm just wondering whether we should be slightly more strategic and say that if it's a joint project, joint storage, and it's higher up and can go back into the river easily, then you may be 3 to 1. If it's a personal one and it can't get back into the river again, essentially, it's 4 to 1. And the reason I'm putting this up now is that is the sort of toolbox I think we could be using to get better community responses and directing community action. But it's also, I'm going to highlight later on, which I think is the next topic or the one after, which is outstanding water bodies, which we may be precluding some of the best solutions by some of those rules in there. So I'm sort of bringing those two things in together. Would that be can you see some sense in that thinking? That you may ratchet it differently depending on the ability to put the water back in the river at low flow times.
We'll give it thought, like, yeah. I've got to work, well, we've got to work it through a little bit in our heads as to how it's going to work. The key thing is, I mean, our key objective is to maintain those high flows.
Yep.
But I can, you know, it will work as long as, I guess, we don't sacrifice the processes that tend to occur at high flows, as long as we don't compromise them.
I'm just not, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that, and we'll check with the lawyers about whether we compel someone to do something with their consent.
We're not compelling anything. We're just saying that you get a
So you said if it goes back into the river into low flows.
no, that it's got potential to go back into the river. Like take Maniototo irrigation, where they put their water back in to the river. They take it out later, but at least it does, at least for a tranche, some good, and it can be left in the river. But if you take it out and put it onto your farm, right, and it never has a chance to get back into the river easily, unless you have to set up another pump system, then there is no economic benefit ever. And that's where I think we're not,
Well, sorry, I think we're getting into a debate here. So I think at the end of the day, Anita's reply was that she needs to take some advice.
Yeah,
Yeah. Because it's not like an easy yes, no answer. I think that's correct, is it?
Yeah. Yep.
So thanks, okay, go on to Brian.
Yeah, cool. So you've got 4 to 1 and you've got 3 to 1. So where the takes are higher in a catchment, you want to leave more in the river. Yeah.
It will be proportionate. It's not that we want to have a higher proportion in the river higher up in the catchment. We want to make sure that that ratio is applied everywhere. So when we set a 3 to 1 or a 4 to 1, it needs to apply everywhere. The current framework is a little bit too loose in that regard. We have a 1 to 1, but you can actually go around that. You can come up with your own kind of bespoke or solution.
Okay, so
We just
I'll
wanna
ask
have
the same
consistency.
question another way.
Yeah.
Why is there a difference between the 3 to 1 and the 4 to 1?
With the 4 to 1, like I said, it means that people are gonna be tapping into a more restrictive system.
In a high take catchment.
In a high take catchment, correct. And so to avoid the risk that later on they'll be losing access to water and ability to fill their storage when a bespoke high flow regime for the long term is determined. Does that make sense?
I think it does. That's okay. Just working it through.
Yeah.
The second point, I'm hoping it's okay, is You've got commencing at medium flow, but is that commencing at medium flow for both of them?
No, only for the high.
So when does the other one commence then?
That would be also, Jackie or Tom, could you,
Yeah, I can talk through that one, Tom.
I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, they're both at medium flow.
Yeah,
aren't they?
both medium flow.
No, it's not right. So the idea with the flow sharing regime is that you take a river's mean annual low flow and you allocate a proportion of it. And so if you're 3-to-1, if you're on a 3-to-1 flow sharing regime, you take 25% of that. So if you take mouth and you've got your primary allocation within that bucket, and if you're on a default catchment, then that would be 20% of that total mouth figure. And say your mouth is 1,000, you take another block of 1,000, and in that second block, you would have 25% of that able to be allocated, which would be 250 liters a second. And then you take another mouth block on top of that and do the same again and the same again and keep moving up the flow profile, and essentially flow sharing with the river. And so you don't need to start at median and those default catchments. You can start from and just keep continuing to move up the flow profile.
You would start at 7-day mouth, wouldn't you? Because that's the top of your minimum flow and primary allocation block. Is that
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Maybe that should be written down there. And finally, Lloyd, so currently 1-to-1, and potentially we're going to have 4-to-1 and 3-to-1. So on a 1-to-1, there's one cube in and there's one cube down the river. Yeah.
yes.
Have we sort of worked, because we're potentially trying to encourage storage, have we sort of worked out what the implications are? So like if there's a reservoir, is the expectation typically, depending on the flow dynamics above the 7-day mouth or above the medium flow, is, has anybody sort of figured out what the impact on storage actually is? Is there no impact on storage? Because ultimately, there's enough water above those flows that ultimately at 20%, 25%, you will fill that reservoir, but just take a bit longer.
Good point.
Is anybody?
Yeah.
We haven't worked it out for the default method, but it is something that we will consider. Like I said, the vast majority of the catchments where we currently have storage, they sit in that bespoke category, and that will take into account when we work out those supplementary regimes or the high flow take regimes for those bespoke ones. Does that sound right, Tom?
Yeah, that's correct. So we'd work through those bespoke ones independently, while working on a primary allocation regime and flow sharing within the within catchments and all of that sort of thing as well. And we'd also look at flow sharing between take and the river.
Awesome, thanks. Good, Brian. We'll go to Gary.
Okay, thanks. So am I right that this whole policy has come about from the enabling movement we're looking at, because we're looking at the changes that are coming with highly modified catchments? Then we're looking to enable storage, because storage has been promoted as a necessity. So that's where this has come about from.
Yeah.
And so if we have storage, so we're encouraging more storage, but then for all of those existing takes, then it is the proposal to fill the storage during their season that their consent is functioning.
Sorry, could you repeat
So
that?
if they have a consent from, say, the, I don't know, 1st of October through to 30th of April.
Yeah.
And so what we're wanting to be is enabling, so we've encouraged storage, But to have that storage, they have to be able to fill it.
Yeah.
Now, across that, they're exercising their consent, and they have their infrastructure already. They've got their takes in the river or in the creek or whatever. They have their consent to be able to take that water. And then, so what we're proposing here then is, if that infrastructure is already there, the flows are higher, so our enabling policy is suddenly available. They need to be able to collect that water and take it, but it's the intention that they are doing that while they are also exercising their consent and irrigating with their infrastructure.
Yep.
Because see, their infrastructure will most likely be operating to their capacity or to the extent that they currently have it at already. So then to fill their storage, they're either going to need secondary infrastructure or
Different time frame.
yeah.
And it will also depend on what their current water permit authorises them to take and then use that water for. So if we're looking at what's currently consented, we do specify the purpose and rate for take and use. So there's probably just a few things.
I'm just going to say what generally happens around the country is people fill their dams in the shoulder seasons and hold the water there. And generally on a supplementary, or the ones that I've had, they're not necessarily time bound. So it's just you get a volume, an annual volume, and a point at time, and when the river's at a particular time where you can take it, and then you can take whatever your allocation is, if and when you can need it. So if you've got a bit of headroom, you take it. If you don't, you can't. And so it's a combination of factors. So I would anticipate these rules would work in the same way, that when the river's at a particular flow and you've got capacity to store and you've got a consent to take, you fill.
Yeah. But most likely is that you're already doing that under your existing consent flows.
Yeah.
Because in the shoulder season, you've got a consent for X amount, unless we're looking to vary those consents that they ramp up and ramp down.
You get a second consent for a supplementary take to augment your primary take.
But to get
And most likely you'd be able to take during winter time or any time that the river was above a certain flow rate. You wouldn't be talking about time-bound seasonal restrictions. This framework would allow you to take at any time.
right,
At any time the river is over.
that is some schemes and some takes will be able to do that, and other schemes need their time off in the winter. So they have to be able to do winter maintenance, do upgrades, do changes. So they may need the ability to install secondary infrastructure. What they'll also need is quite long-term consents to justify.
So what we can do is we can have an enabling plan framework to harvest when there's lots of water in the river, an enabling consent process, and then what people need to do outside of that to realise that is what they need to do to realise that.
It's a different question.
The other thing, and I might have not articulated, 4-1, which will apply to the bespoke catchments where the majority of the supplementary ones are. That's to basically deal with new applications or new proposals. We had a chat, and we think that the best way to proceed with this is to let the existing infrastructure, let it operate under its consent conditions until we've got the bespoke limits in place, and then take stock. But the 4-1 is not going to be imposed on any existing ones. It's just to deal with new, like the Tari and the Manaharakia. We don't want to put a moratorium on harvesting. We can anticipate that there will be people there that are thinking about new, new storage. So we need something in place to deal with those applications. Yeah.
It's going to be quite relative to the size of the infrastructure of delivery and the size of the storage.
Yeah.
Okay.
Gary, we have Alan.
Thank you. Tom, did I hear right that you are looking for some direction on whether these 3-1, 4-1 ratios are appropriate?
Yes, I mean, like I said before, we don't want to go back to the 1-to-1.
Yeah.
I think we've got some feedback from our ecologists that is not an appropriate regime. But if you think that the 3-to-1 is too restrictive, we could probably relook at that figure and find something that is close, that is a little bit less than that.
Because I guess, I mean, I personally can't come up with a figure. I can only do that on the basis of some advice on what is suitable for that river in terms of our priority, our top priority in Te Manawa, in terms of looking after the health of that river. And I guess I need that advice from you people as to what is the suitable ratio to be safe for the health of that river in those different cases. And, I know looking at a default one, not looking at the individual ones, which would be different. I suppose my question is, can you commit to what numbers we can safely talk about?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question. It's about risk. Oh, sorry.
Well,
So I can probably help with that. So we've put together a bit of analysis in terms of what these flow sharing regimes would look like. I think it was in the folder with reports that were still in draft. It's one that we've only just managed to complete. But broadly speaking, there's a report there, and I'll find the title of it and share it shortly. I've just got to dig it out of the folder. Broadly speaking, 4-to-1 is a quite an ecologically conservative regime. 3-to-1 is pretty similar in terms of percentage allocation. You're not, the difference between a 3-to-1 flow sharing setup and a 4-to-1 flow sharing setup is pretty nominal. And in actual fact, when it comes to developing these sorts of regimes, because of some of the limitations that Gary was talking about before in terms of infrastructure and other bits and pieces, it can be quite hard to fully for a wider catchment to fully exercise their consented take under a given flow sharing regime. So 3-to-1 in actual fact probably looks close to 4-to-1, unless you've got a super efficient and very well set up infrastructure base across the catchment to be able to make sure that you're taking all of the time and any time you can. So our scientific advice broadly would be that 4-to-1 is provides for the ecological health of the river and probably achieves something like Te Manawa. And 3-to-1 is also very, very close to that. And because of those practical reasons that take is limited in the real world, 3-to-1 probably achieves 4-to-1 anyway. And so the two are very, very similar.
So can I just summarize to say, I think our preference is 3-to-1 and 4-to-1, but we recognise that it's a significant difference from 1-to-1. And therefore, if you want to have a discussion around that, we could go away, but this is where we think they should be.
Yeah, okay. No,
That's the staff position, I think.
yeah, no, thank you. That's helpful. If this is where you think they should be, that's what I want to know. And I'm prepared to take the knowledge that's behind that.
So any other questions? We've got a couple of repeats. So go Kevin and then Brian.
On the basis that we are in an enabling approach to it, and that we are using 3-in-1 and 4-in-1 to be both to enable the water to be taken, but also to enable good, sound, ecological, environmental. So we're taking that sort of conservative approach. As long as we continue to emphasise that we are there to enable it, that we may have to change things once we get the closer realities of each tributary, each river. I'd be very happy just to go with what you've proposed there. So I'll just leave that conversation.
We're getting into debate, yeah, but we'll go to question. Have you got a question, Brian?
Yeah. Sorry, is there a time frame on that, or is that 12 months a year?
Yeah, it would be, yeah, they would apply for a consent on whatever conditions they wanted, but there would be no reason why they couldn't get that an annual allocation as a
So like,
high flow.
the
take.
3-to-1, 4-to-1, they can take that in time. But in the winter, there's more chance that they can do it because it's above
Yeah.
medium flow and
think that's
I
that.
mean, the rivers do peak in all sorts of times of the year. So,
It's based on the flow of the river, Brian.
Yeah.
We got, so I think questions are pretty much done. So anybody, there's been a suggestion. Have you a question, Eva, or you?
I do have one very brief. Are there examples elsewhere outside of Otago of this type of take?
Most regional councils have a high flow harvesting regime.
Right, because it's, and is the paper that Tom's going to share with us reflect some of that knowledge or information?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, good, thanks.
Thank you. So we'll go into debate. I think as we, and, I think as we're going around, we just need to think about whether you think the, the 3-to-1, 4-to-1, how, that you're happy with that, or which one you're happy with, or were you happy? Kevin's had a bit of a say on what he thought, and anything else that you want to talk about. So we go into debate now, if you like. My thoughts, I'll start it off. My thoughts basically are keep it simple and just have both of them at 3-to-1. That's my thoughts. So rather than
Yep.
the trade.
Just don't close the door on what could be a really good storage options for community generally. And I would be more enabling of communities having collective answers than individual answers, especially. So for me, it doesn't keep it simple. It's keep it what can get the best environmental results potentially. And those options take a lot of work to get a whole lot of people together. So should be, and if they can give some environmental benefits, should get it potentially easier, not easier, and a different criteria path. But yeah, I just think we're looking at some of the stuff the wrong way around, but that's what it is.
Thanks, Kate. Brian.
Cool. We've been informed that the 4-to-1, 3-to-1 fulfilled at Te Manaau to Y, and we've been informed that 4-to-1's probably is ecologically conservative in a higher water demand catchment. And until I'm provided with any further information, I'll go with that.
Thanks, Brian. Anybody else? Gary?
I think for me, it's about bespoke, and every river is different, every situation will be different. And just sort of a big move from 1-to-1. This is solving potentially the reliability issue that sits with many situations in this, as we move to far higher environmental flows in rivers than to sustain what is out there in any way. Then we have to be very careful. I think it has to be river by river, as opposed to just broad brush setting something as that has to fit everybody. It will have some big infrastructure challenges as well, which is why it again needs to be very set per river. That's where I see it. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Anybody else? No, Richard.
I'll go and jump in behind you, Lloyd, I think. Yeah. Yep. I think 3-to-1, which is what we've heard from our staff who have analysed ecologically what they think is the best, most robust case that's likely to actually get through in a panel. A bespoke model that allocates more than that, unless we can see some data that says that that's a robust case, because we've heard that between 4-to-1 and 3-to-1, there's not much difference. So if there was some sort of gradient that shows that 2-to-1 is good too, I don't know that. But at this point, I've heard that 3-to-1 is acceptable and likely to be okay. Yeah, panel. Yep.
Awesome, thank you. I probably just think that under the hierarchy of things, all the waterways is treated the same.
Yep.
So I think it doesn't, where the river, I think, that's the way we treat all the rivers the same on the 3-to-1 as opposed to different ones until such times you get your bespoke ones. Any other comments? Elliot?
support the same, although I guess I'd say if we are just gonna do the same ratio for both schemes, better safe than sorry, to sort of go with the more conservative ratio. So,
Thanks, Elliot.
Thanks. Yeah, look, I mean, I can live with either of those suggestions we've been discussing, but I recognise that there is a difference between those two groups, because one group is already more hydrologically modified and therefore perhaps more vulnerable back to
Yeah, I think much as Ellen has just said, I think in those areas where there's much more pressure on existing rivers, this is a dynamic change. And I think it should be go for the conservative. I think that can always be reviewed, but to go the other way, always take a slightly less conservative approach. It'll always be hard to claw back if it's wrong. But it is dynamic and it's a significant change in the way the water is going to be taken and stored, and ultimately it should, if it works well, it'd be great for the rivers, what's in them, and also for the people who need water. So I'm misreading that paper if it's in the list of science papers. So until I read that, I'll go with the conservative level.
Thanks, Edward. Any other comments? We're getting a bit of a feel for that one.
We're 3.5, are we?
I think at the end, of the day, there seems to be general acceptance of the system. It's just sort of around the number.
I think that it's just ensuring that there's, what I heard is that we really consider that science carefully around, is there a difference between 3 to 1 and 4 to 1, and use that to guide whoever comes back as that preferred.
Yeah.
But that we are there to provide for this supplementary take when the levels are higher.
That's awesome. Thank you. We'll move on.
We have actually changed the order slightly. Oh, sorry. Well, it's just because Felicity's got to catch a plane. Sorry. We can race right through them though. I would be very happy to sail on through.
You kick whatever you want. Yeah.
Sorry, is that going to cause?
Yep.
Oh, okay. So next would be outstanding water bodies.
Yeah, no.
It's not total mix up.
So, outstanding water bodies. These are defined in the NPS FM as being water bodies that have been identified as having one or more outstanding values. ORC has undertaken a project to identify those water bodies and assess their values, which has resulted in a list of water bodies, outstanding water bodies, which have different values. They're outstanding for some water bodies have more than one outstanding value, but some only have one. So the list that was identified through that process was made public during the consultation, and it included the water body, a map of the area, and a description of the outstanding values. In terms of feedback, there were a lot of concerns. Mostly, I think that the feedback received reflects that the material that we put out didn't explain what it meant if you were an outstanding water body, what activities could happen or not happen, and there was quite a lot of concern about what the impacts would be on landowners and consent holders of water bodies being identified as an outstanding water body, particularly that ability for existing activities to continue and querying whether existing activities could continue. There was a bit of a fear that it meant prohibiting everything and that you wouldn't be able to do anything. And there was some, in addition to those general concerns, there were questions about why some artificial water bodies had been included, and some people picked up either mistakes in the description of values. There was a reach
within a UNESCO site, and it referred to the wrong reach. So there are things that do need to be corrected that people have picked up. There have also been suggestions for additional areas that might be outstanding, or opposition to some water bodies that have been identified. So we're going through a process at the moment to fix any mistakes that there are in the descriptions at the moment. And we have asked the experts who initially did the assessments to have a look at the additional areas that people have suggested, or the additional information people have provided about why their water body shouldn't be considered outstanding, and ask them to consider whether that changes the original assessment that they undertook. But ultimately, I think the main thing that we need to explain, I think, and it's unfortunate that we didn't when we went out in the consultation, is that being an outstanding water body doesn't mean that you can no longer undertake activities in that water body. Most activities that are permitted under the plan are also still permitted in outstanding water bodies. There are a few examples, there are a few exceptions to that, like bridges over water bodies that have outstanding natural character values, because structures like that can have quite a significant impact, so they would require consent. But if you're not a permitted activity, then you're in a consent framework, and the direction in the NPSFM, excuse me, is that the values have to be protected. So it is a reasonably high bar, but it certainly doesn't prevent activities from happening. So we're not suggesting any changes, because I think what is provided in the plan at the moment does allow activities to continue, but we can't get around the direction of having to protect values that the NPS requires.
Thanks, Felicity. We've got Kate and Kevin. And Andrew.
First question is, and this was a serious question, it may sound flippant in light of our Queenstown FDS paper. Is this our, do we have the whole body of work on this one? But seriously made me wonder, because this was a contracted out, this work, this identification. Do we have access to all of that? Because I was really surprised how few had recreational values in there.
Yeah, the technical report.
The technical reports are there, they're in draft form.
So we can provide those through to councillors and diligence on the same basis of some of the other reports that are in draft form, if you'd like those.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting. I just want to make sure that we hold that, because at the end of the day, I don't want to be in court without understanding that better. The other part of that is the Felicity, ambitious of you to say named, we listed them. We didn't list them. That is one of the frustrations of people, because we don't name them. You've got the Rock and Pillar, it's just called the Rock and Pillar. There are about 20 creeks listed, shown on the map, but not named. And so people actually haven't been able to identify if a particular creek or waterway is included. It's not well mapped.
Yes, I agree with that. And the reason for that is because the natural character assessments were generally done on an area basis. So indeed, there was, they didn't look at necessarily in all of the individual small tributaries in a hillside area. They looked at a wider area and considered that because of the type of vegetation and the lack of modification in that wider area, all of the water bodies had outstanding natural character. And that is explained in the assessment reports.
I appreciate it is, but if you couldn't find out that your creek was or wasn't an outstanding water body, then it made it really hard to know if you were really impacted or not, or what your degree of.
I agree. The schedule itself does say Rock and Pillar. If you go to the mapping system, you can see the individual water bodies that are mapped, and they all say Rock and Pillar, which is unhelpful.
And it doesn't.
But you can see, if you know where it is, you can find it on the map.
It isn't that clear given some of those gullies, with all respect. And that's only one example. That's over all of those ones. So that, I mean, it is important that we give clarity at the next stage, that people actually understand what it is. Now, the other question why I asked about recreation is, if something's got recreation and ecological values, at the moment it's only got ecological. If they've got recreational values as well, and I'm thinking of things like the Upper Scroll Plains, where people use quite regularly for recreation, and God's Own and various other people have put boats and kayaking down there. I just want to second guess, making an outstanding water body just for one purpose, does that preclude Or does it enable it, if you do add recreation, that it may be able to get activated in an easier manner? The effect of this is if it's just ecological, you've just got one lens on it. If it's recreational as well, does that give you two lenses, or does it always prioritize ecology?
No, you get two.
Yeah.
There's no
Yeah.
differentiation between an OWB for one value or for.
That's right,
yeah,
they're not
for a
treated
different-
any differently.
But if you wanted to do a recreational activity, which may include putting a very small ramp or something in there to activate it, does that make it easier if it is got a recreational value, if it's only got an
Yes.
ecological?
Because if you're protecting the values, then
Yeah.
and you're enhancing access
Yeah.
to that value, then yeah, I wouldn't imagine that would be.
So you can see why I'm worried that there has been, I mean, I can actually understand why Lens was more ecological, but actually we've got 4 priorities and they haven't been well covered. I don't think.
Well, there's been a really robust process, and you'll recall that the recreation component had some challenges. But the same level of scrutiny has gone across all of those values. The numbers, I don't think, reflect the fact that there has been a really robust process, and we are just going back through and checking. So there hasn't been a priority on one value over the other.
No,
We've been
sorry.
given equal.
I can find it would be very easy for some people to focus on the ecological values, given the questions that were asked, rather than the recreational values. That's all.
I see.
Thank you, Kate. We've got Kevin, Kevin, Andrew.
Yeah, so in here, we've got permitted activities continue to be permitted within OWBs with limited exceptions. And one is the placement of new structures. So if I currently have, I was going to say my mind, but if I currently have a bridge, over a waterway now, and that is, it's past its use by date, I still need that bridge. Is that going to be called a new one or a replacement one?
That would be a replacement.
Yeah, so that's still one, but so we're not going to stop me doing that activity.
That's right.
But if I had no bridge there at the moment and I wanted to do one, you're going to have to come and get it.
That's
consent.
right.
Yeah,
Yep.
cool. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Kevin. We have Andrew. Move on.
I have seen commentary, not a minute, but through the assessment process for outstanding water bodies, there's been some reference about other existing outstanding features that aren't water bodies that actually impact on that process. Have I got that wrong? Nothing to do with what we've talked about so far, but it may be outstanding landscape area, for example. So is there still some grey area about the identification process for outstanding water bodies?
So originally for landscape, there was a criteria that said any water body within an outstanding landscape is an outstanding water body, and that resulted in lots of water bodies being identified. And so once we saw that result, we spoke to the consultants and revised it so that there was an additional criteria that would be the initial kind of first cut,
Yep.
And then you look at actually how much does that particular water body contribute to the landscape, and generally it relates to size. You know, a large river has a much more significant impact on the landscape value, so there was a second filtering exercise applied after that.
Excellent, thank you.
Well, thanks, Andrew. Gary.
So,
Sorry, Vaughan.
sorry, Brian, join. Just on, so outstanding natural landscape versus outstanding water bodies. I think a lot of the concern I saw certainly in Wanaka was around those who have suffered through having an imposition of outstanding natural landscape and not understanding what that actually imposed until they had it, and then found all sorts of challenges. So outstanding water bodies, does that impose a similar level of imposition?
I think that you would generally find there is much less just because there are fewer things happening in water compared to on the land around the water. And what we're really talking about is the water bodies themselves, not the development that's occurring necessarily around them, unless that development is going to have some kind of like permanently reduce the values of the water body, which in most cases it wouldn't.
Because if you're in an outstanding natural landscape area and you're trying to do whatever you're trying to do, you're almost stymied from the get-go. So that it doesn't impose that level of.
No, it doesn't.
Right.
No.
It's also value specific. probably?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. So what we did once we had the list of, what the consultants also provided was threats. They provided information on the threats to particular values. And so with that information, we went through the entire plan and looked at every rule and said, would this be okay in an outstanding water body or not? And for 95+% of the time, it was fine, because it's permanent, large permanent modification that really destroys those values. That's the problem. And you have to be doing something pretty significant to have that outcome. So I think, yeah, it's not as restrictive as landscape type restrictions.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Brian?
Who's that?
That's my child, sorry.
We're trying to, correct me if I'm wrong, we're trying to preserve existing activities and outstanding water bodies, and we're going to consent new. Yeah. What happens, like, say, Lake Wakatipu sewage treatment plant on the side of the outstanding water body, consistently non-compliance issues, high risk. Why are we enabling the preservation of that? You know, because
Oh no, so sorry.
It's a question. Yeah,
When those activities come in for, if you're an existing consent holder, your consent will expire at some point, and when that new consent application is lodged, they will have to demonstrate how they're protecting the values of the outstanding water body. So there will come a point where.
So there's still the standards and there's still the expectation, but they have a right to remain as long as they achieve all that standards. Yeah.
There's an additional lens on the consenting.
Yeah.
That says you can't do anything that impacts the values.
Yeah, I think you're talking hypothetically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing,
yeah.
one thing I will just clarify is that the assessments of the water bodies were undertaken with all of these existing activities already occurring, and they were still considered to be outstanding. So there isn't the same kind of restriction, I think, concern about those existing activities, because even with them, the water body is still outstanding. So there's less of an impediment to those activities still carrying on.
It's oddly true of a lot of farming practices right now.
Thanks, Brian. We've got Tim.
Just a real life example. I remember being, I can't remember where we were, but Butcher's Dam was, I think, is shown as an outstanding water body. And we met the owners of Butcher's Dam, and they were saying that they can drain it to completely empty at the time. So what does this actually? What will this prevent them from doing that? And I know it's the same with the Moss Swamp too, with the Minnetonka Irrigation Company. So what sort of changes are they going to see?
So the Butcher's Dam has been identified for having outstanding landscape characteristic, landscape values. And so I would expect that there would be restrictions on, I guess, how low you could potentially go without affecting the landscape characteristic. But I'm not sure that it would be, I mean, you'd have to drain it a lot, I guess.
Yeah, but that's it right at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it is. So there may be restrictions on the ability to drain the entire thing.
I suppose it's also, if it is their private, they've got the ability to take the dam away.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. We have asked the consultants to clarify in more detail why artificial water bodies were included in the assessments. Yeah. I mean, it's a hard thing, because some of them do have really high values for a whole bunch of things that are not related to irrigation, but they do have a practical purpose as well.
Yeah.
And that one example can only be drained to the level of the tunnel.
Yeah.
So once it reaches the level of the tunnel, it can't go any lower.
Yeah, that's right,
So
which might be enough.
It doesn't empty, but it does go visually lower than it's about half.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, do you have another question? I saw you.
Oh no, look, I was really into it in debate, but I'm just really concerned that in the process of trying to protect what I think is quite amazing when you look on it, substantial amounts of waterways. They all have values, and every bit of water has values, even if they're not in the outstanding water area. But we may be, climate resilience hasn't been factored into any of this, but as far as I can tell. and the need potentially to do storage at a scale or at a level that is far better for the environment than on-farm privatisation of water. And that's where I'm going to be consistent. And I think I've said it before, if we don't start, if we make the rules so hard that we stop some of that happening, or close that door, then I think that's really unfortunate. The fact that we are talking about some outstanding water bodies that were created for the very, and have got huge values now, and then look at potentially precluding them by saying we have to stop this now is really unfortunate. You know, you look at Onslow, you look at Butchers Dam, you look at Great Moss Swamp, they're all listed here as having really good environmental and ecological values now, and they're not natural. And yet we look like we're making it much harder to look at what I think is going to be a response to climate resilience that we need to be considering.
Thanks. Okay, Andrew?
It's actually a question, and with natural features, and it talks about form and function, flows and patterns and all the rest of it. Where does that sit with the outstanding water bodies identification process? Or is that sit alongside as well?
So natural character is one of the values that was assessed. So there are some water bodies that have been assessed as having outstanding natural character. But all water bodies are subject to the RMA, and there is direction about preserving the natural character of all rivers and lakes. So there's a level for outstanding water bodies, but then there's restrictions for all activities because of the RMA as well.
So knowing what you know about Otago, when you talk about lakes and rivers, we in terms of quantum size of lakes and rivers, are we talking about pretty much the water body network throughout Otago?
There are a lot of
it flows on, 24/7 or 365 days a year.
Yeah, there are a lot of outstanding water bodies identified for their natural character values because of the amount of ranges and mountains and things where there are lots of unmodified water bodies, tarns, creeks, streams. So a lot of those have been incorporated, have been identified as outstanding water bodies. A lot of them are also within conservation land, so it's, that is the one where there have been a lot of water bodies identified.
Yeah, I was focusing more on from a water planning perspective rather than what's around it. Only the patterns and flows and stuff.
Yeah, and I think the criteria, off the top of my head, the criteria were primarily on the level of modification. If there's been no modification, then it's naturally got really high natural character. The other aspect that was considered was the makeup of the vegetation in the riparian margins, because if you've got a high percentage of Indigenous vegetation, that's obviously a lot more, that's higher natural character than introduced species.
Thank you. Just following up from what Kate was saying before. So you've got your outstanding natural water bodies, but you could still get a consent to do some climate resilient stuff or whatever, if that was to be a bar.
Potentially.
Yeah.
And there is provision in the RPS, if you recall, in the integrated management, I shouldn't speak to this, this is the expert, in the integrated management chapter that talks about some of those climate resilient type activities, and there's policy provision and support for them in there.
Yes, but we can't, we still have to give effect to the NPS, and that's where most of the restrictions come on avoiding the loss of rivers and things like that.
Yeah, and my other question was, so you'd have to go through a consenting process or whatever it is, but then over time you can change the consenting requirements via a plan change. Is that right?
Yes.
I understand that right? So yeah. One question. Has anybody got any we've pretty much had a pretty good talk around this one. Is any like final comments? There hasn't been like.
I'm happy to go with the suggested change. No change. And noting that I think one of the people at the top of the table up that way have got a plane to catch, so.
I think,
Yeah. Gary, yeah.
I think the comment I would make is around these designations do have an impact, and if they are going to capture existing man-made structures, storage dams, that type of thing, who are already operating, the habitat has been created by these and has existed there, but they've done what they do. Then we have to be very careful around what the imposition of that is. And so more clarification that we have, or the more technical work that's being done around that would be good.
Thank you,
we'll
Gary.
provide
Andrew?
and just following up on Kate's point, and Gary's probably alluded to it now, and it's just, we need to make sure that as we work our way down this process, that we keep landowners or people who will be impacted on this informed, so they fully understand when the 30 June comes, you know, the whole process of something's at stake from a landowner's perspective. That information's got to be clear and available.
Thank you, Andrew. Any other comments? So the feeling of the room is to go with your suggested change.
Yeah, that doesn't, that says no changes, and yet you've said there's other work happening. So there may be other changes, with all respect. You've said that you may be looking at other values. So I'm not quite sure if that's correct.
Well, yeah, that's true. We're not proposing to change the management framework that's in the plan, but there might be additional areas identified or removed from the existing list.
Same process, just refining the process and checking and that sort of stuff. Does that sound good? You can do that.
Chair.
Oh, we got a plan.
We'll put it now.
Over there.
Well, we've got nothing to it, it's for not
I
doing
didn't do all
anything,
that.
so.
We could finish by 5.
Felicity still playing catch.
Oh, good, first we can go, we can do other issues on top of that.
Yeah, okay. And we're gonna call it, just, we'll call it, so thanks very much, it's been a big day, and I think it's good to, we got quite an easy day tomorrow, it's just finance, really. But just before we finish up, I haven't taken too many notes, but I've got a couple of notes where just follow-ups from today. One was with Michael around getting data around mining consent numbers and takes, and also I've got down Cape Willow control for around the spraying and whether there's what sprays we can use, etc. And then also another one from Kate around that supplementary allocation, you know, with what Kate was saying before, we're going to get a legal opinion on whether you can, you know, whether what Kate was suggesting. I'll have to check with Kate to make sure I've written it down right. It's maybe able to.
It's a priority for group rather than individual stuff.
Yeah, so just a wee bit of feedback to come back on that one as well. Okay. Once again, thank you all for partaking pretty much fully in the discussions, and we'll meet this time. We'll meet again next week, I dare say. So, Edward, would you like to close us off again?
Oh, well, yeah, okay. Kua mutu tātou nei mahi tahi e whai ake tēnei kaupapa miharo. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te ata whai tō tātou ariki, a ihu kroti, kia tau, te rangi Māori, Āmeni.
Amen.
Sure.